Years ago, during my teenage years, my friend Justin and I would often go longboarding late at night. We were night owls, and we loved the freedom that came with skating at night. We rarely encountered anyone on the roads or paths we frequent, and even on the main roads, it was uncommon to see a car in our rural area. The peaceful silence of the night made it easy to hear or see any approaching vehicles from far away due to their headlights and the sound of the engine disrupting the calm. We were really into longboarding at the time, and we would sometimes ride for miles, not returning home until the sun rose. One night, we decided to venture a bit farther from our usual routes, choosing one of our favorite hidden paths. It started with a narrow paved path that separated two sides of a long lake. This path would often sink underwater after heavy rain, so we wanted to use it before it became impassable. It stretched about 2 miles, and the scenic ride was always relaxed. After reaching the end of the lake, we kept going, turning onto a very secluded path leading into a densely wooded nature preserve. As we approached the first hill, we both noticed a small, dim light moving at the bottom in the pitch-black darkness. Its strange movements intrigued us, and instead of using our flashlights, we stood there watching, whispering to each other about what it could be. Suddenly, the tiny light transformed into several blinding lights, accompanied by loud revving sounds that overwhelmed our senses, which had grown accustomed to the dark and quiet. Fueled by fear, we immediately turned and ran as fast as we could. We heard shouting and the sounds of vehicles getting closer. Luckily, we managed to dart off the path and into a dense, dark hole on the side of a hill, overlooking where we had just been. We hid in this natural dugout, hoping the plants and shadows would conceal us from whatever was happening out there. From our hiding spot, we watched as 4 men, 2 on ATVs and 2 on motorcycles, rode up to where we had been standing. They yelled at each other, but we were too far away to make out what they were saying. Whispering quietly, we tried to figure out who they were. At first, we thought they might be park rangers, though we had never seen any in the area before, and we doubted the budget would allow for patrolling the woods at night. These men, however, were on vehicles completely unsuitable for bike trails, and they were clearly furious about something. They called out things like, "We know you're out there," and "Come on out, can see you." We stayed silent, hoping they were bluffing, but when one of them shouted, "Find them now," and smashed a bottle, all hope that they were rangers vanished. We watched as they split up, each heading down a different path, including the one we had originally come from. Felt like an eternity before we dared to move. We were paralyzed by fear, watching the lights of their vehicles zigzag through the woods. One of them even circled back to where he had started. I considered calling for help, but I was too afraid that even the smallest light from my phone would give away our location. Finally, after the lights of the vehicles had gone far enough away, we gathered the courage to get up and run again, hoping to find a safer place to call for help. We sprinted through the woods, hiding whenever the headlights got too close. But as we moved farther, the woods became less dense, and our hiding spots grew increasingly scarce. The fear of being caught while hiding under nothing but leaves and plants was unmatched. Eventually, we made it to an intersection of 2 main roads, far from where we had started. We ducked into a ditch to make a call. When I checked my phone, I saw I had missed several calls from our friend Connor, who we were supposed to meet up with for longboarding. I called him and urgently asked where he was. Luckily, he hadn't given up on our plan, and he was just a few miles away, already heading in our direction. I gave him the names of the streets we were near and asked him to pick us up as quickly as possible. Connor arrived before the men could catch up to us. We jumped into the back of his car, shouting for him to drive. The relief I felt as we sped away is indescribable. After we explained everything to Connor, we decided not to call the police. We figured the men would be long gone by the time an officer arrived, and we didn't want to risk getting in trouble for being on the path so late at night. To this day, I still have no idea who those people were, what was happening. Over the years, I've heard various theories from friends and family. Some believe we stumbled upon a drug deal. Justin and I later admitted to each other that when the revving started, minds immediately went to chainsaw-wielding horror movie killer. Whatever those men saw or thought we saw that made them want to chase us so badly, we'll never really know. Years ago, when I was in college, I was having lunch with some friends in a beautiful outdoor plaza when I noticed a guy I vaguely knew from class sitting alone at another table. He seemed a bit shy and looked lonely, so I called out, "Hey, you're Ricky, right? From social class? Why not join us?" He agreed, but he remained quiet. Everyone introduced themselves and made an effort to include him. That was the only interaction I remember having with him, until a few months later. Out of nowhere, about 4 guys I barely knew cornered me at work during my break. They said, "You've been a real jerk to Ricky, and it has to stop." I was completely clueless about what they were talking about. When I asked, "Who's Ricky? Are you sure you've got the right person?" "I don't know what you mean." They didn't believe me. One of them accused me, "You're leading Ricky on, then blowing him off, then leading him on again. He's at campus health right now being evaluated, and it's all because you messed with his head." I was absolutely bewildered and terrified. These guys were furious. Fortunately, at that moment, my older coworker stepped out and asked what was going on. One of them responded, "Your friend here has been messing with our buddy Ricky, and we're making sure she stops." I replied, "Ricky, from my social class, I barely know the guy. What are you talking about?" My coworker's presence seemed to deflate their bravado a little. She was livid and threatened to call security, warning them they could get arrested for harassing me. She also told them that she knew me well, that I would never mess with anyone's emotions, and that they clearly had the wrong person. Still confused, I asked them to explain. "Wait, want to understand what's going on? I know Ricky, but we've only spoken once. What's happening?" Long story short, that day I thought I was doing a good deed by inviting a lonely classmate to sit with us. Ricky somehow got the idea that I was in love with him. He sincerely believed it, and his friends never questioned it. They believed every story he told them, never stopping to wonder why he and I were never seen together. For a while, I wondered if Ricky was intentionally lying to make it seem like he had a girlfriend. And when I didn't show up, he just said I dumped him. But as I learned more about certain psychological conditions, I now think he genuinely believed his fantasy. When Ricky had a breakdown, supposedly due to my cruelty, his friends took him to campus health and then came after me. They even knew where I worked. That realization scared me. How far this had gone without me knowing anything about it. To this day, none of those guys ever apologized. In fact, at least one still thought I was lying, even after it was clear that Ricky was mentally ill, and something was very wrong with him. At the time, it was bad enough. Looking back, it's even more terrifying. How could all of this be happening, and I was completely unaware? It frightens me how easily people believe lies, and how they refuse to admit they're wrong even when presented with the truth. I'm incredibly thankful for my coworker and how she stood up for me. It's a terrifying feeling when angry people confront you and you have no idea why. That was one of the most confusing and frightening moments of my life. Afterward, I was always on edge whenever I saw Ricky, one of his friends on campus. I have no idea where Ricky or his friends are now, but I regret ever inviting him to lunch that day. This occurred around a year ago when I was on Grindr, browsing for either fun dates or possibly a new relationship. For those who aren't familiar with Grindr, it's a social media app primarily designed for gay men, often used for casual hookups. One day while scrolling, I received a new message from a guy. Let's call him Brian. I checked out his profile pictures, skimmed through his bio, and found myself interested. We started chatting back and forth. He seemed like a genuinely kind and charismatic guy, someone who could hold a conversation, something rare to find on that app. After a few days of messaging, we swapped numbers. He seemed nice enough, and I was curious to see if he'd be as great in person as he was over text. So I asked him out on a date. He eagerly agreed, and we made plans. The idea was simple. I'd drive to his place, pick him up, and we'd head to my favorite local coffee shop for some latte. Around 6 p.m., I texted him to let him know I was leaving. He replied, "I can't wait to meet you." I smiled at what seemed like his sweet demeanor. But halfway through my drive to his house, I got a call from him. The conversation went something like this. "Hey Brian, what's up?" I asked. Brian responded, "Hey, quick change of plans. I'm feeling a bit tired, and I'd prefer to stay in. Would you be okay with hanging out at my place? Maybe watch some shows and order takeout?" I hesitated. That's not really what I had in mind for a first date. Prefer to go out. "Oh, don't be such a buzzkill," he said. "Just come over. I promise it'll be fun." The way he spoke on the phone gave me an odd feeling, like something was off. I had imagined his voice would match the light-hearted tone from his texts, but over the phone he sounded rushed, even a little frantic. Despite my gut feeling, I agreed, assuming maybe he was just tired from work. I pulled into his driveway, and he greeted me at the door. He looked exactly like his pictures. Handsome, with fashionable glasses, dark straight hair, and light skin. When we got inside, one of his roommates was in the living room playing Dark Souls. To be polite, I introduced myself to the roommate, not wanting to come off as rude to Brian. After a brief exchange, Brian called my name, signaling for me to follow him into his bedroom. As I walked in, I was met with something straight out of a horror movie. Candles were lit all around, and as I looked closer, I noticed various altars scattered across the room. There were strange, ancient-looking statues, animal bones, jars filled with unidentifiable liquids, and a dagger placed next to a cat skull. It was beyond bizarre. One altar had a glass container filled with yellow liquid surrounded by animal skulls, and another had a creepy doll with its eyes sewn shut and hands missing, resting on a shelf next to his bed. Part of me screamed to leave immediately, but I hesitated. I didn't know much about certain religions or practices, so I didn't want to jump to conclusion. Maybe I was overreacting. Plus, I can be a bit impulsive, so I convinced myself to stay and see how things played out. To ease my nerves, I asked Brian what the altars were. He said he'd explain later. A strange response, but I brushed it off, thinking he was just eccentric. I pointed to one of the altars and asked about it. Suddenly, his mood shifted. "Don't touch that." Snap. His sudden anger startled me. I wasn't even close to the altar, yet he yelled at me like a parent scolding a child in church. Confused, I quickly apologized. In an instant, his scowl turned into a smile, and he invited me to sit with him to watch a show, as if nothing had happened. His quick mood shift unnerved me, but I sat down, hoping things would go back to normal. After we started talking, Brian's demeanor softened, and he became more like the person I had messaged, sweet and soft-spoken. We shared stories, and it felt more like a regular first date, easing my anxiety a bit. But then he turned on the TV, and I was still unsettled by his earlier outburst. To defuse the situation, I suggested inviting his roommate to join us. Brian immediately shot down the idea, his mood flipping from laid back to angry again. He started bad-mouthing his roommate, swearing that he absolutely despised him. The sudden shift in his personality was alarming. Then he changed the topic and started complimenting me, saying how attractive he found me. His hand grazed my thigh, making me uncomfortable. I excused myself, saying I needed water, and as I stood up, he slapped my butt. I didn't like it. As I walked to the kitchen, I debated leaving, but something about his room, with all the altars, kept me on edge. I'd seen enough horror movies to know that situations like this could go bad. When I returned to the room, he was sitting on the couch with his legs crossed and eyes closed, muttering something under his breath. I called his name, but he didn't respond. When I called again, opened his eyes, uncrossed his legs, and acted like nothing had happened. The whole thing was unsettling, but I stayed calm. I didn't want to upset him. His behavior kept swinging between normal, aggressive, and I felt like I was dealing with two different people. I knew I needed to leave, but I didn't want to risk angering him further. Some point, Brian got up to grab his phone, and I decided to test his reactions. Playfully grabbed his butt, hoping it would ease the tension. But immediately, he turned and swatted my hand away, lunging at me with his fist raised, stopping just inches from my face. His expression was cold and emotional, his eyes wide open. For a moment, I felt like prey in front of a predator. Then, he unclenched his fist, cupped my face in his hands, and forcefully kissed me. I was frozen. His words were patronizing, as though he were talking to a pet, and I felt disgusted. After that, I decided I'd had enough. His mood swings, creepy room, and his increasingly erratic behavior were too much. I stood up and told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to go home. He tried to convince me to stay, but I insisted. He let me leave, though it was clear he wasn't happy about it. As I drove home, I was shaking, relieved to have left, but terrified by what had happened. I blocked Brian's number and his Grindr profile, and I've kept my profile private ever since. Thankfully, I haven't heard from him again, but I still fear he might come after me someday. Everyone has that one set of neighbors they love to hate. They're always partying late into the night, throwing trash onto your yard, and asking to borrow things they never return. While bad neighbors are unfortunately common, the year of hell these neighbors brought upon my family was far worse than any typical awful neighbors. I'll let you be the judge. It's challenging to condense such a story into a brief narrative, and I worry the tale may still be quite lengthy. Across from our house, property became available for rent, which would soon open the gateway to our nightmare. We were acquainted with the owner, so some of this information comes from what she shared with us after. The first sign of trouble appeared when the new tenants moved in. Parking a nice Lexus on the lawn and driving their moving truck onto the driveway. The Lexus was suspicious. The habit of parking on the lawn quickly ruined it over time. Another red flag was the constant stream of people coming and going. While the exact number of residents remained unclear, the regulars included an overweight blonde, a somewhat more decent brunette with glasses, an unpleasant punk boy, a teenage girl who seemed like a part-time prostitute, and two small toddlers, a boy and a girl. This new addition to the neighborhood quickly established themselves as the loudest residents, with seemingly endless parties and arguments that stretched on for hours. Their language was shockingly vulgar, with even the youngest child using inappropriate words. Despite the pleasant weather, we couldn't open our windows without being bombarded by loud, vulgar music blasting from their open garage, where one of the teens worked on a dented car. Another issue was the toddlers being left outside in the front yard for hours, unsupervised. Clearly reliant on welfare and government assistance, the most frustrating part came in the first full month when they began asking for it. The brunette woman was usually the one who showed up at our door, often with a child in tow. Initially, their requests were for everyday items like sugar and eggs, which my mom, being too kind, couldn't refuse. Over time, the requests grew more unusual. Diapers, an electric griddle, which they eventually returned, and even asking to charge their phone when their electricity was cut off. This became a frequent occurrence. The worst was yet to. On a sweltering summer day, I looked outside and saw the teenage girl dragging a screaming toddler into the house after he had been running around alone. She then shut the screen door behind her, began kicking the child while hurling insult. Horrified, I called my mom, who immediately went outside to confront her. When the girl responded with hostility and threatened to call the police, my mom quickly called Child Protective Service. Shortly after, the blonde woman, gangly teen son, and the violent teenage girl were banging on our door, furious. My mom carefully opened the window a crack, stating she wouldn't open the door. The angry woman shouted at my mother, telling her to stay out of other people's business. This confrontation lasted nearly half an hour until my mom, fed up, warned them that as long as she witnessed such cruelty and foul language, she wouldn't stay out of their business. She threatened to call the police. They didn't leave her property. She closed the window and blinds despite their curses. Eventually, police were called by other neighbors for similar issues, and the family received a warning and an eviction date. They stayed weeks after the water and power were cut off, and when they finally realized they had to leave or face arrest, they did everything they could to destroy the house. The landlady was devastated as she showed my mom the now vacant house. Smashed windows, ripped out sinks tossed into the yard, walls filled with holes, filth everywhere. Though it's been some time, and the house now has new occupants, the memory of those neighbors remains vivid. I hope no one else has to deal with such terrible neighbors. When I was around 13 or 14, a new student named Jack joined my school. Given our large student body and the densely populated neighborhood, new students rarely made a splash. However, Jack seemed shy and out of place, so I thought it would be nice to introduce myself and show him around. Little did I know what I was in for. Jack was very tall and had a notably large frame for his age. Initially, he didn't come across as creepy, just a bit awkward, which was fairly typical for hormone-driven preteens, so no red flags were raised. I don't remember our early conversations. He always made a point to greet me by name, even when I was with friends. Reflecting on it now, I suspect he might have had a crush on me, but since I wasn't interested in boys, I didn't pick up on it. Things took a turn for the strange when our teacher assigned us to decorate the covers of our sketch pads with something we were passionate about. I probably chose a band I was into at the time, but Jack's cover was a graphic depiction of an open heart surgery. Not a drawing, but an actual gory photo of a human heart. The teacher, like everyone else, was understandably unsettled and likely had a private chat with him. However, as far as I know, Jack was allowed to keep the cover, despite its graphic nature. Later, I asked Jack why he chose such a disturbing image. He told me he was deeply interested in cardiology, spent his time watching surgery videos online, and hoped to study it in college. While still odd, this explanation made some sense. But then, things escalated. Over the following weeks, Jack repeatedly claimed he had a part-time internship at a hospital downtown because his grandmother, a nurse, pulled some strings for him. He even wore scrubs to school one day. It was obvious this wasn't true. No hospital would employ a 13-year-old. Yet, Jack seemed to genuinely believe this, or at least wanted me to. Couldn't decipher his intention. At one point, Jack asked if I wanted to see some medical tools from the hospital. I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because I was becoming increasingly anxious about what might happen if I didn't play along. To my shock, He brought a whole collection of medical tools to school. Scalpels, scissors, and an entire dissection kit. I'm not sure if he brought them from home or stole them from his grandmother, but I was, and this is no exaggeration, horrified. I still can't understand why he thought bringing such items to school was a good idea. We never hung out outside of class, which, in hindsight, was probably for the best. Jack must have thought this was his only chance to impress me with his supposed medical knowledge. I pretended everything was fine and normal before reporting the incident to the principal. They contacted Jack's grandmother, who was as shocked as everyone else by the discovery. As far as I know, Jack faced no real consequence. This incident occurred toward the end of the school year, and I moved to a different area shortly afterward for unrelated reason, so I didn't follow up. Thankfully, Jack never tried to harm me or anyone else. I think he genuinely believed it was acceptable to bring potential weapons to school. Can't help but wonder what could have happened if I had crossed him. Didn't play along with his fantasy. He was notoriously volatile, and I was lucky he seemed to like me. I'm pretty sure Jack was mentally ill. I knew he was depressed because we briefly discussed it, but I now believe he was also delusional. Nearly a decade ago, mental illness was often avoided, and the school probably didn't investigate further or guide his family appropriately, which is disappointing. So, creepy kid from middle school, I genuinely hope you're doing better. I'll never forget our interaction, and not in a good way.